Welcome to Anthodish, the show about food, culture, and identity. I'm your host, Dr. Sarah Dugnan. What makes food queer? Is it possible to name and list it out as simple, clear-cut elements? In their new co-edited volume, Queers at the Table, doctors Alex Ketchum and Megan Elias explore this question with a community of writers, illustrators, and recipe creators. As an anthology of essays, comics, and recipes, the book reveals the dynamic and transformative ways that queerness informs food production and restaurant culture, and how food empowers, transforms, and unites queer and trans folk. If Alex's name sounds familiar, it's because she's returning to Anthodish. Alex is an assistant professor at McGill University's Institute for Gender, Sexuality, and Feminist Studies, and the co-organizer of the Queer Food Conference. Since she was last on the show to discuss her DIY zine, How to Start a Feminist Restaurant, she's also written Ingredients for a Revolution, a history of American feminist restaurants, cafes, and coffee houses, as well as Engage in Public Scholarship, a guide to feminist and accessible community. Megan is the director of food studies programs at Boston University, and a historian of American foodways. They are the author of 5 books about food history, with the most recent one being Food on the Page, Cookbooks and American Culture. She teaches courses in food history, food and gender, and food memories, as well as the introduction to gastronomy. Together, on today's episode, they share the behind the scenes about how Queers at the Table came to be after the Queer Food Conference, the intersections of queer identity and food culture, and including the importance of community in queer food work, challenging traditional culinary and gastronomic norms and binaries through cooking and sharing food, safety in cooking and kitchen spaces, and expansive considerations for queering food spaces in the future. Here's my conversation with Megan and Alex. Welcome to the show, Alex and Megan. I'm so excited to have you both here. Do you mind sharing, before we jump into our bigger conversation, a bit of background about who you are, where you're both coming in from, and the type of work that you do?
Sure. Yeah. I'm Megan Elias. I'm a historian. I mostly write about food history, mostly US. And I'm the director of the food studies programs at Boston University, which is a combination of academic approaches to food and hands-on culinary pastry, wine, and cheese.
And I'm Alex Ketchum. I'm an associate professor at McGill University, and I'm also a historian, and I teach in the gender studies program, and I write a lot about food, queer labor, feminist studies, and more.
Awesome. And congratulations. That's exciting. It's a jump from the last time you were here, so that's awesome to see.
Thank you.
So we're here to talk about your new book, Queers at the Table, and it's a very community-driven feel when you're looking at it. So what are the roots of this project, and how did it get started?
I'm so glad that it has that feel to you. That is really our intention. It started with a conference, and the conference started when Alex came to talk about her wonderful book about feminist coffee houses. And I was telling her that I'd had a conversation with a student about wouldn't it be fun to have a conference about queer food and just get lots of people together to talk about this concept? And she said, well, like, let's do it. What's holding you back? And so we did, which is, was really, really great. And then coming up with the book, Alex had the idea of making something that wasn't like a boring conference proceedings, but had some life to it. And as soon as she said, and there would be comics, I was like, oh God, yes, right? I love comics. And of course, recipes, because we can't do anything without getting back into the kitchen.
And we were able to see the themes that would be in the book based off of what people were proposing for their conference papers and panels, and then kind of seeing like what was resonating during the conference itself. And then we were also able to invite some other people to contribute.
Oh, that's really smart. And yeah, as soon as I saw the graphics in it, I was so hooked, because when you think conference proceeding paper, it's a very rigid, cold kind of approach. And so the fact that this came from that, to me, was so surprising and cool.
Yeah, it should feel like you're almost like with the people, right? So that it has that feeling of being in community with other people.
So can you speak a little bit more to the process of incorporating the illustrations and how they were used to, approach some of the themes in the book, and the partnership that came of that as well?
So one of the really exciting things with this project was that we were able to partner with Prism Comics, which is a queer comics cartoonist association that supports people in the industry. And so when we wanted to incorporate different types of media in the book, we reached out to Prism to work with us to help us connect with some cartoonists. And we also reached out to folks whose work we really admired, and they helped facilitate that. And then we also, with kind of some guidance actually from one of our book agents, Rob Byring, he suggested, well, for the recipes, why don't you have the cartoonist illustrate them? And we got really excited about that idea because of like Samin Nosrat's like salt, fat, acid, heat. And it was just a really nice way to also kind of interweave the contributors together and show the different ways that people are connecting with queer food and how individualized it can be while also being part of a community.
And then we make a little community of the artist and the recipe writer. So like some of them have never met each other, but they exist on a page together.
Oh, I love that. It was cool too because I was just thinking about, I'm reading Ruby Tando's new book, All Consuming. And so she's looking at, the Martha Stewart sort of illustrations and things like that. And so I was thinking about those earlier cookbook illustrations and how they're very formal and particular and of a certain era. And these illustrations totally flip the energy of it in a really invigorating way as well.
And I think that in itself is a queer approach, right? This like, there is no one way to do something. Martha, I have so much admiration, but everything is perfect, right? This is the perfect way to do something and there's no room. And, I think that's part of the queer approach to food is that there are infinite varieties of ways to do these things and to enjoy them.
Totally. And I want to talk a little bit more about that too, because something that hits right off the get-go with this book is that you're really challenging how there's these mainstream ideas of, professional kitchens and home cooking. So can you speak a bit to how these ideas are unpacked or reframed across the book?
Yeah, I think there's a few different ways that we approach this in the book. So part of it is that people's own relationship to home cooking and how often it's very gendered labor. And so as people are exploring their gender identity, some of our writers from the trans community or who are gender diverse, they're thinking through like what it means of the lessons they learned growing up and how they're able to take that on for themselves, as well as for some of the contributions that deal with like, what does it mean to cook in a queer relationship and queer partnerships and polyamorous partnerships and so forth. And then also some of the contributors, especially for the recipes and some of the essay writers are folks who have worked in professional kitchens. And they're really interested in challenging things like the brigade system, which is very hierarchical. And this is tied to a longer history of especially lesbians and queer women, like within feminist restaurant spaces of challenging these hierarchies. But we see it throughout the contributions in the book.
And I should say also at the conference, the folks who provided the food, we didn't see them as caterers, but as contributors. So they came and they talked about their food and they talked about what made their businesses queer. So they gave us some living models of what is it like to run, an inclusive, supportive food business. And we'll have that again at the conference in May in Montreal.
That's huge because you never, I feel like catering in particular is one of those things that really flies under the radar of visibility too.
They come in, they drop it off, they go away. They're supposed to be unseen as if food arrived by magic. And, I hope one of the things that this book shows is that it's magic, but it needs to be visible, right? It's very real.
It was making me think too of that one particular essay where it was looking at food festivals and the explorations of that as well, and how it really is so central. And to me, when I think of music festivals in particular, food is so important, but it's not negotiated as something that's valued as much as fueling your body to continue listening to music as well.
Yeah.
Exactly. And I think that's something that's really important too with the conference itself that inspired this book is that we really wanted the food to be something that is central and is the thing that deserves space and attention. And it's not just we're just going to fill our bodies with coffee and push through and end the day feeling terrible. But even after the day of the conference, then we had events that were in different locations around Boston. The first conference was in Boston in order to connect with other venues and stuff. So the food was always just being put at the forefront.
I want to talk about the themes of the book because there's sort of 4 main themes that go across it. Was that part of the conference structure or was that afterward when you were looking at what essays came in, how you wanted to stylize that story as well?
Yeah, a little of both. Thinking, looking at what came in, not imposing a structure, not imposing topics, but to say, okay, what is it that people want to talk about when they want to talk about queer food? What are the themes that arise from that? We wanted the themes to arise organically. So we just waited to see what people wanted to talk about at the conference. What did they propose rather than imposing something onto them and sort of saying, this is what queer food is about. So the themes arose and then we organized the book proposal around those themes. And then our editors reduced it. So we had 10 themes originally. And then they saw a way that our themes themselves had overlap, and kind of shortened them to a different number of, of themes that they thought would work better in the book. And I think it's fine. Like, at no point in the process of putting this book together did I ever think, oh, we have to fight this. The publishers were just amazingly supportive and great to work with.
It was a really collaborative process and it felt very fulfilling. And it felt like there was a lot of respect for the project and that the contributors could be respected. And so, yeah,
Yeah.
it was really wonderful.
Good. Glad to hear that, because that's one of those things, especially with such a large collaborative project. There's so many different authors and illustrators and moving parts. So the fact that that
Yes.
can maintain its collaborative energy all the way through sounds really fulfilling.
And I think a really important part of that is that Alex secured a grant to pay all the contributors so that it was recognized up front what their time was worth.
Yeah, that's huge, because I think that's something, particularly when looking at, bringing those stories to the forefront. I am thinking particularly about that quote that I believe it was John Birdsall in your book was talking about, where it was feeling as though you were like doing an archaeological excavation to get out queer stories from history. So I'd imagine there's a lot of research and labor, but there's also probably also a lot of emotional labor that goes into those too.
That's a really good point too. Yes. Yeah. And hopefully being part of the book and being in that community sort of also is a bit of a, an emotional payback too.
And I think another way that we've wanted to honor that and also continue to foster these connections and networks is that in addition to the book coming out and saying, like, look, this book is an object in the world, we have around 17 or so events over the next year with different contributors kind of being mixed and matched. So everyone's speaking at least one, some people at multiple, and they're a mix of virtual and in person and hybrid events. So people can kind of showcase their work, talk about their process, and meet other contributors that they may or may not have met at the conference.
Yeah, it's lovely to be. We've been on some Zooms with people who are both in the book and they not met each other before and they're getting to see each other. And I think just personally, I tend to be a bit shy about promoting my own work. I think, oh, nobody needs to hear from me, whatever. But this book, it's like, it's not me, it's these 38 people that the world needs to see. So it can be, it helps me overcome that sort of shyness about it.
I definitely appreciate that reluctance to share your own work piece to it as well. But I think the fact that you've managed to foster a sense of community within the authors, within the illustrators and creators here, also extends to how people experience reading it as well. So one of the themes, looking through this, obviously it's divided into themes, but as you said, there's a lot of like interplay between how they relate to each other as well. And I'm curious if you can speak a bit to the idea of safety around being in a kitchen and what that means, because obviously there's professional kitchens, there's also home kitchens, what cooking looks like across the board for that. There's one piece in particular that I wanted to bring up because it was talking about how, when you're accessing food banks in particular, a lot of those are run by faith-based organizations. We're in a time right now where that's not a safe option for certain people. So how do you determine experiences of safety setting foot in a kitchen for a queer cook?
It's a good question. Yeah. What do you think, Alex?
I think safety is working on a lot of different levels within themes in the book. So, as you mentioned, there's the piece about food banks written by Danielle. There's also around kind of safety in terms of like access when like food is part of health and healthcare access. So we have a couple of different contributions that deal with how folks are navigating HIV and AIDS and their connection to food and how foods can be used as part of like nourishing and creating like better living conditions for people. And then there's also parts in the book about kind of food as part of their emotional safety, either of like the ways that they've used food to connect to family members or friends or partners, but also when they've chosen not to be part of kitchens because that made them feel unsafe because of how they would be perceived by others or rejected by others based on their gender presentation or not fitting within certain heteronormative norms.
Yeah, I think one thing I'm always happy to do is to challenge the idea that food is love. That it often isn't love, right? And when you're being forced because people perceive you as a particular gender to learn culinary skills, that's it's not love, it's norming. And I think it's important to see all those things as well as to understand, of course, that food brings us particular kind of joy to us.
I like that distinction also between joy and love and what food can offer in those spaces, because I think that really takes to task that idea of food as love, and everyone can be at the table, because there are sometimes spaces where everyone cannot be at the table too, right?
Yes. I think people have asked us about this a lot too, about like what makes a kitchen queer or what makes a food space queer. And it's that inclusion, right? It's that this is the place for everybody. This is a place where people are not excluded for any reasons.
And that it's also trying to foster support for others. So not just that they're not excluded, but that they're invited in.
Can you talk a little bit too about that, like the idea of inviting people in, and what that has looked like, whether it be examples throughout the book or different pieces of queer history where people are invited to particular tables through food?
For me, and it kind of speaks to questions too about what is like a queer restaurant or a queer space. Those are kind of questions that I'm always asking myself. And part of it is about who's running the space or the project or the business. And I think that's a really important key element. But it's also like, what is the space doing? What are the people running the space doing to make it feel welcoming? Are they creating the opportunities for community organizations to host fundraisers or book readings or have art on the wall? Are they using their potential capital in order to support like other kinds of projects, right? Like, how are they trying to foster community through the creation of their space? And so we can see that in terms of just like within the restaurants themselves. And then within the kind of recipes that people are discussing in the cookbook as well, it's like, how are they writing the recipe in order to bring people into different types of knowing and knowledges and different communities? There's a way that a lot of our contributors, I'd say all of our contributors, have written their pieces to not have the sense that knowledge must be assumed, but actually
Yeah.
to invite people into the conversation.
And in a funny, like really technical way, we dealt with this with the recipes. Our press asked us like, shouldn't they all be in the same kind of measuring units? And like, nope, I don't think so. And it's not just that I don't like to do the conversions myself because I don't like that kind of brain work, but it has to be the way that the person knows it and thinks about it, right? If I tell you that it's a cup of flour, it's my cup of flour. And
Totally.
it's just it seems like a little tiny thing, but it's so it has so much to do with how cooking and food preparation are embodied stuff, right? And that everything we do as it feels like it's we're presenting ourselves through that work.
Yeah, and I feel like by not making that change to make them all uniform, it creates, like, for people that are trying those recipes out at home, that automatically shifts how they're going to approach that. They don't necessarily come in with that like same expectation every single time too.
Yeah, you have to shift. You have to get into somebody else's kitchen essentially, right?
Yeah, that is very cool. So that also, throughout the book, you're talking a lot about nourishment. Like, that's kind of an undercurrent to how it's looked at. I'm curious to get your thoughts on how you interact with that idea of nourishment, because I know sometimes it can be this like really fulfilling thing, and then sometimes it also, I feel like it's at risk of being co-opted by like more harmful wellness movements. So
Yes.
Yeah.
I'd
So
love to
true.
get your thoughts on that.
Yeah.
So I think one way that we can think of nourishment in a way that's not being co-opted is by thinking about some of the contributions that are talking about queer food from the point of the seed and from the plant. And really
Mm.
thinking about that food isn't just this thing that we're experiencing as humans and as consumers, or even as producers as humans, but actually that we're part of a greater ecosystem from the seeds, from the plants. We can forage food, and that we are just part of this larger system, and that we actually are playing a part in nourishing that system ourselves, like providing nourishment with our own bodies and with our own care and our own farming practices and foraging practices and gardening practices.
Yeah, I think that section of the book is going to be very revelatory to a lot of people who may have thought about food but haven't thought about agriculture and haven't thought about seeds and plants and the through line to food. I think that is exciting. I was thinking about Dave Davenport's comic Peanut Butter Cocktail,
Yeah.
which is about um, a kind of internal battle over different kinds of nourishment and nourishing the all kinds of desires, I guess I could say, just to leave it intriguing for
Yes.
people. But I found that piece so moving, and I've heard from other people too that they have that it's in some ways it's taking on that kind of concept of wellness culture and healthism, but with a very a sort of a darkly humorous
Mhm.
take. So I recommend that as a way to rethink nourishment. That again, it's not just like nourishment good. Sometimes you're nourishing the part of you that you don't want.
And I
Yes.
think on a kind of meta level too, the design of the book is meant to be nourishing because it was wonderful to work with the press and they were totally on board. We're like, we want lots of bright colors. We want people to feel like people will feel a lot of different emotions while reading this book. It's not just like all positives and all like one type of like vibe of joyfulness, right? There's feelings of grief and loss as well. But I think people oftentimes do feel nourished while flipping through the book and reading through the different parts. And they can then get physically nourished if they make the recipes, but also creatively nourished as well.
Yeah. And I think, I love that there's visuals in there because there's something about it where you're reading an essay and then you go into a totally different story through the art, and there's like almost a pause where you feel it in a different way, and it just causes your brain to think about and approach things in a slower way, I would say. Like especially in an age where we're really driven by like fast-paced algorithms. There's something about seeing the visuals of how people are expressing queer cooking, queer food that allows you to have that sense of nourishment that you're talking about.
Good.
Yeah. Yeah, it was so beautiful. And I think, when you're talking about the bright colors and the approach too, I think I remember when you're looking at this idea of queer food, really tackling the idea of like rainbow colored cupcakes and things like that being this kind of surface level idea of queer food.
Yeah.
So
And I was just going to say on that. And we also aren't trying to say like that can't be queer food, but that's not all that queer food is. Like sometimes it is nice to have the rainbow cupcake, but there's a lot more to queer food than that.
Yeah. And it's delightful to think that everybody wants a rainbow cupcake. Like it's not something that people are going to be able to resist. And it's so queer, So it's just like the idea that it's really everywhere, that it's not something that's hidden at all.
yeah. I'm wondering too about the idea of feeding within the book because there's so many different ways that people are fed or they are feeding the people in their community and their chosen families. Can you share a little bit about those ideas of feeding that appear?
Yeah, I think there's a sense kind of throughout the book that that feeding is um, never going to be just personal. That it's that you're always feeding. You're feeding ideas. That you're feeding a community. That a lot of the kind of intention behind queer food is to feed those not just people, but kind of like those ideas that have been sidelined or suppressed. And so the food kind of builds, I mean, again, back to this concept of nourishment, that the food nourishes visibility, that it nourishes persistence. I'm not going to say resilience, but it nourishes, a movement almost in a way, or feeds a movement.
And while I think it's throughout the book, I think the section we take care of each other is really kind of putting that in the foreground of Leah Spears's talking about feeding people when you're grieving, or Ashley Gilroy's work about feeding people when you're trying to like expand your family, whatever that means, right?
Mm-hmm.
So lots of different ways.
The particular comic that you were talking about with that one as well, I thought was so interesting and really expansive in how feeding is used beyond, I think particularly looking in a domestic level. There's quite often this like hyper gendered, hyper rigid approach to what that looks like, and the feelings around it can be, particularly for people struggling with different gender identities, that can be very, very limiting. So I love how expansive it is in that.
Yeah, I know that there's something for everybody in this book so that anyone could pick this up and say, oh, yeah, I had this experience of, when I was trying to get pregnant or my sister did, or, and it's a very common experience of thinking about how do you feed your body to produce a child, right? It's just so many people have that experience and the tension and the wonder, like, can this really be done? So I think that and many, many other of the comics and the essays just touch on things that are very common, very universal experiences.
I'm reluctant in particular to ask outright like what is queer food, because I think this book explores how there's so many multitudes to what that can be and what that looks like and how that's interpreted by different people. But what I am curious about is, because this is quite a process for both of you in coordinating the efforts of all these books, or all these essays rather, So, what has that process been like in terms of understanding queer food for yourself? Has that shifted anything in the creation of the book for you?
I think so. I would say that when we went in, at least for me, I had kind of a sense of like, this is how I'm going to define it, in part because I had to define it for the book proposal and for the
Yeah.
conference and for the grant. And so I kind of had it down to it's about who's cooking the food, but it's also that it's doing something by and for a community. And that it's also tied to these important queer histories where there's things like the pot brownies to help combat wasting syndrome. That's like a byproduct of HIV, AIDS, and other things like that. Like that there's these foods that are tied to key historical moments and community moments. But I think Megan's much better at explaining this too, but of this way of thinking about it on the metaphorical level, kind of tied to these ideas from queer studies of challenging binaries, but also a lot of our contributors have interpreted this differently. And I think Megan is really good at talking about the ways that it's expanded.
Yeah, I think I'm not one to like to draw boundaries around anything.
Yeah.
So the idea that you could ever say something wasn't queer food, I'd never want to be there, right? No matter what, I'd always want to be able to say something is queer about that, right? Because that frees things up in a way that I think is very powerful. Definitely for me, and I think I mentioned this before, through the conference and through the book, what was most amazing to me was this connection to farming and to seeds and to plants and botany. Like I'm still thrilling to the idea of non-binary botany. It just like after that workshop and after that essay, I'm like, the world looks different to me. And I
Yeah.
like, oh, I have spent, whatever, 55 years not knowing this stuff. And it's just like, it's like a new spring.
100%. It was really thrilling to me to see that too, because that's something like when I was back in my teaching days, when I was talking through like bioarchaeology and looking at skeletal like individuals, being able to teach that in a way where you're not assessing gender and the sex, even like assessing sex on a skeleton is very, very tricky to do, and it comes on a gradient. So that's an opportunity to kind of reframe what you're looking at. So to see that and how that plays out in other elements of biology, I think enters into a really cool space in science where a lot of
Hmm.
things can be open to reinterpretation and looking at it in more nuanced ways as well.
Right.
There's so much gender diversity within the plant and animal kingdom and sex diversity. And yeah, and I love that these essays and comics and stuff are pointing to that and allow for this openness.
Yeah,
Yeah. And always to ask, is it really? Is this really binary? Like, no, it's not.
totally. So I'm wondering too, because a lot of like as I near the end of the book and like thinking about how this stemmed from the conference in particular, it really feels like a beginning. So I'm curious what's in store for the Queer Food Conference, or if there's any other additional things that are coming up for both of you or the community that you're building with this as well.
So I think in the most immediate future, so there's obviously this book, but there's also going to be the second Queer Food Conference in Montreal and also hybrid online on May 1st through 3rd, 2026. But also, we don't see this as the endpoint. We really want this to be something that inspires others to take up this project, work with it in different ways. And so we hope that other people also with the Queer Food Conference, we want to support others also kind of taking this on themselves, and whether they want to do another international conference or have smaller conferences. And I've created kind of a guide about conference organizing to support that work because, like, I don't ever want us to be like, we are the queer food conference people. We
No.
are the queer food people. We want it to be
Yeah.
like opening doors and expanding opportunities. And I think one of the things that was really rewarding with the last conference was especially having a lot of graduate students come up to me and say, no one in my department was respecting my work. I was really trying to push for certain thesis or dissertation topic, and people were turning me down or saying, like, oh, why would you want to study that? And then they told them about this conference and that there was a space for their work, and then they started to get support. And
Right.
so I think that's kind of what I see our role is trying to kind of steward space for others to build upon and create opportunities. Because I know when I was doing my research as a grad student on feminist restaurants, like the lesbian and queer run ones, that a lot of folks were like, why would anyone care about that? Where are
Yeah.
you going to even publish? Like all those kinds of things. And so I don't want the new generation of scholars to have to go through that. I want there to be space for them. And also, to be clear, our conference isn't just for scholars, but that was just like one of the really nice things that came out of it.
Yeah. I'm really looking forward to going to many queer food conferences that we have not organized. And that, I know that they'll have lots of different themes and organizing principles. And I just can't wait. And I know they're going to happen because there's just so much buzzing and excitement.
Yeah, totally. I'm very glad to hear both of you say that, because that was, for me as a reader, I was like, this is very propulsive. There's so much here to start off with, and you can see it going forward and building much bigger communities. So I'm very happy to hear that. I'm curious, just as we kind of wind down, if you mind sharing where people can find Queers at the Table, as well as anything else that you've got going on online that you'd like to share.
Oh, so much.
For sure. So the book is published with Arsenal Pulp Press. So you can find it probably at your local bookstore. If not, ask them to stock it. Ask your library to stock it as well. We love library orders. And it's available as a physical book as well as an ebook. You can find out more about the Queer Food Conference at queerfoodconference.com. And then you can find out more about me and my work, including the book that we kind of gestured towards, Ingredients for Revolution, at alexketchum.ca. And I'm pretty easy to find on the web. And our Queer Food Conference Instagram also, at Queer Food Conference.
Can they find me? It's not that easy, but at the BU gastronomy webpage is about the program that I'm the director of and the super fun things that we do here.
Perfect. I'll have that on the show notes and on the website for people to check
Thank
out
you.
so they can follow along as well.
Awesome.
Megan and Alex, thank you so much for joining me. Your book is such a delight. It's so powerful. I'm very excited that it's out, and I appreciate you having the conversation with me.
Thank you. It's lovely to talk to you. Such good questions.
Thank you. This was really fun.
That was Dr. Alex Ketchum and Dr. Megan Elias. I've linked their book and social media in the show notes below if you want to follow along and learn more. You can also find all this at our website at anthodish.com under episodes. Thanks so much for tuning in. For more Anthodish, you can find us at anthodish.com or on TikTok, Instagram, Threads, Facebook, or Blue Sky at Anthodish Podcast. Feel free to drop us a line and let us know what you think about the episode. I always welcome conversations and reflections on what you've been learning from the show. Music composition was done by Lucas Wojcicki. Anthodish is produced in partnership with the American Anthropological Association. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we'll catch you next week.